It is officially mock draft season. Today, we are going to be going through a mock draft done by a bunch of fantasy analysts and podcast specials hosted on the Slider Draft platform. You're listening to the Ball Boys. Let's go!
Hodge has done it from nowhere. Hoisting the goal from inside the field. Sheed from the boundary. Dusty.
G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys AFL Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy. And like we said, guys, we're going to go with another draft video a day later than previously. I have been away the last week, but back in Brisbane, back in the studio, ready to talk about AFL Fantasy. And we're going to get to those tier videos eventually. But today, we are talking about a mock draft. The first mock draft that I've participated in this season. And I want to do a bunch of more mock drafts this season. I think it's an area of fantasy drafting, both in all sports, that is extremely, extremely valuable. And I've talked about this a bit online before, but I think that thus far, over the few years that I've been involved in AFL Fantasy, the ADP data almost tends to be a little bit backwards in the fact that the ADP influences the drafts that happen. But when especially you have some mock drafts done by people who are analysts or podcasters or content creators or whatever the hell you want to call us, I think that can dramatically shape the ADP of fantasy drafts. And the reason that I think that is because obviously thus far the AFL fantasy sites don't offer a public mock draft system until now. This Slider platform, which is by Magic Sports, Selby, of course, former coach of Moreira's Magic, has put together for us. So something that I definitely want to do more of in the preseason for 2025. But this is where we're going to start. We're going to talk about the mock draft, the results, and go through not only my rationale of my team, keeping in mind we recorded this on Monday just gone, so it was early January, so obviously it was for the Footy Record that's going to come out, I think in February or March, or whenever it does come out, so a lot can change, so do keep that in mind, but it does give us a good indication of where we are talking about for fantasy drafts and for fantasy classic. I think there's a lot to be gained if you're a fantasy classic coach, even if you don't play draft. Looking at draft rankings, looking at mock drafts, seeing people's confidence in going for those players that are maybe underpriced, undervalued. Where can people sort of, put their balls on the line and say, yep, this is where I think this guy should go, especially in a draft like this where no one, I don't think, necessarily fell through because everyone in the draft room is pretty switched on. So we're going to bring up the draft board here. It is, you'll see a lot of players straight up. So on the YouTube side of things, if you watch along, you'll be able to see the grid in what is the Slider platform, which I think is super, super useful. We'll just make sure it's at the top here and we'll bring it on screen here. So I was drafting from pick 6, which is probably one of my least favorite positions to be drafting from. I think I heard Stevie Fizz on the Draft Doctors talked about this as well. I love drafting sort of close to the turn. So pick 8, pick 9, I think would be my preference this season because you can, I think, again, I heard Steve Fizz talk about this and I agree. You can kind of dictate, okay, who's going to go behind me. You can almost predict, okay, what positions they have, what positions they don't have. Can I try and snag 2 of the players that I'm looking for? Whereas in the middle, pick 4, 5, 6, 7, it's sort of like, okay, wait to see who falls to you. And there were some situations where I think people did fall to me, some situations where I think I had to reach on certain positions as well. So we'll go through my rationale in what happened here. So as you can see on the draft board, at pick 6, I went with Lachie Whitfield, the players that went before me. Harry Sheezel straight off the bat at pick number 1 was a bit of a curveball. I did not expect that. However, I don't dislike it. I think I tweeted about this, that if I was just straight talking positional value, I think Harry Sheezel is the number 1 draft. Now, this league, this hypothetical league, is a captain's on option. It is a 3-4-1 4-1-3 formation with 4 on the bench. We actually drafted 8 on the bench, but that was a mistake. So I only watched the first 4 bench picks here. It's obviously a 10-team league, snake format as per normal. So Harry Sheezel in a captain's on league. I think I'd feel a little better going one of the rucks before him, but he would be my third selection. I have no issues with Sheezel going number 1, but some people might be surprised about that. And I was surprised too to see him go there. Sherry Marshall went next off the board, to be expected. Errol Goulden was pick 4, and this is a pick that I personally don't think that I would have gone with. Because of the formation, 3-4-1-3, typically you would see maybe that be 5 midfielders, or in a deeper league you might have a 5-7-1-5. And the fact that there's only 4 midfielders to 3 defenders and 3 forwards reduces the value of those mids semi-significantly, in my opinion. So Errol Goulden, who went at pick 4, who's to say he's going to average significantly more points than Tom Green, who went at pick 18, or Andrew Brayshaw, who went at pick 15. Hell, even Jordan Dawson at pick 25, I could easily see a rationale to say that he's going to average more than Errol Goulden. However, players like Max Gawn, Lachie Whitfield, Bailey Smith, even later on, there's an easy argument to say, okay, well, how much of an argument could you make that someone like, if we took that Dawson same line, do you think that Max Holmes is going to average more than Lachie Whitfield? I think that that's much more of a debate, or it's much less likely, in my opinion, that a Whitfield is going to average less than Holmes. Do you think that it's a bit further down, but Nank or English are going to average more than Max Gawn? It's possible for English, and he was at the start of the second round, but the drop-off in those positions, I think, is far steeper. So in the midfield, I would want to really lock away those tier 1 of the other positions first before dipping into those midfielders, which could be a dime a dozen, Errol, Merritt, Dacos, Bont. A lot of you would argue that Errol shouldn't be the first midfielder off the board, and just that argument being there alone, you can have difference of opinion. I think Errol's a top 4 mid, in my opinion, but just the fact that argument is there leads me away from not picking that position. Going into the draft, I was hopeful that Lachie Whitfield was going to be there. I heard Stevie Fizz, who obviously, if you haven't checked out his podcast, do so. He gives his perspective, and obviously he's a very experienced drafter himself. He was talking about the fact that he was tossing up between Lachie Whitfield. He wasn't sure Max Gawn was going to be there. Perhaps Max Gawn should have gone in this pick 4 slot. I personally was going to, Lachie Whitfield in this type of draft, I would have picked as early as pick 4. I think with the elevated value of those defenders and defenders and forwards, he would have been if I was sitting in the spot that Louis was sitting in, I would have gone Lachie Whitfield at pick 4. Potentially a Max Gawn next. Potentially a Bailey Smith as high as that as well. So I think that draft formation is extremely important, and always really important to keep in mind. So as soon as you start playing around with the settings, as soon as you start playing around positions and things like that, it can have dramatic effects on the draft board, because it creates a difference in the value of the position compared to the waiver wire. And that's always a very, very important distinction to make. If we had to draft 7 midfielders, I would be flipping my tune. I would say, yeah, go Errol Goulden pick 4. Go and pick 3 if you want to. I think that would definitely change my opinion on those sort of things. So very happy to see Lachie Whitfield there. He was the guy I was targeting. I didn't expect any of these top 3 guys to make it there. Lachie Whitfield was the number 1 guy I'd hope would fall to me, and he did. After my pick of Whitfield, we did have a midfield run, Merritt, Dacos, and Bont. Just a shout out to Roy, the trader. I love what he did in this draft. Bailey Smith, I was wondering when the forwards were going to go off. I myself have talked about going Bailey Smith, even in a deeper midfield. Even if this was a 3-5-1-3, I would take Bailey Smith as high as pick 9. In this draft, I think I would take Bailey Smith before any midfielder, personally. So he would have been maybe a pick 5 or pick 6 in terms of if I was doing every single pick. So Roy pulling the trigger here at pick 10 on the turn, I think is great. Tim English is a very interesting one, who was Roy's second pick on the turn there. obviously was the highest averaging player just 1 year ago, so could have some value there. Avoiding the midfield in the first and second round, I think is definitely a solid way to go. Then we had some defenders go off the board in Flanders, Zorko, and Sinclair. Now, my strategy is all based on tiering, right? So if I think that there's a break in a tier, I want to get the last person in that tier before I see a drop-off. And this is all predicated on the fact that I believe my projections are right, obviously. Why would I make projections that I think are wrong? But so when I select a Lachie Whitfield here, it's because I think I can see a significant difference between a Whitfield and the next bunch of players, which I would agree Zorko falls into, Sinclair falls into, Flanders potentially. I think a Nick Martin could be in that range as well. So those are the next four I had in my tier. But the fact that I'm able to get this player who's a tier above in my projections before these guys go, I think is a win. And then getting Andrew Brayshaw, I think at pick 15 was a surprise. I thought he would go ahead of this, but I had him in the same tier that I had a Zach Merritt, that I had a Nick Dacos, that I had Errol Goulden. I have him in the same bracket as those players. So getting the last player in my tier 2 for defenders, which is Lachie Whitfield, the last player in a tier 1 midfield, which is Andrew Brayshaw, I was very happy with that start. I think it's a good start to the draft, in my opinion. In a captain's league, I'm happy to put the captaincy on either one of these players. So I think I'm pretty happy with that start there. Then I can start to look at more positional analysis and things like that, forgetting about the captaincy as an issue moving forward. The second forward off the draft was Jason Horne-Francis. This, again, was another bit of a surprise for me. I wasn't sure exactly how hard people would go onto the forwards, and it turns out harder than I thought. I thought I'd be able to get some of these guys a little bit later. I was hoping potentially a Bailey Smith would fall to me here, but obviously these guys are switched on. So Horne-Francis going there. Horne-Francis being the second forward off the board is interesting. I think it's obviously very defensible. He's probably the safest, I would say, of the next guys left. So I could definitely see that being the play. I see him, Dylan Moore, Jack McRae, Caleb Daniel, all very similar. I have a bit of a bunched up tier 2 and tier 3 of these forwards, all of which these players are a part of. Some more mids, Butters, Green. I won't read out every pick here, guys. If you're on YouTube, you can see it going along. I'll just sort of, from here, highlight what I think are the interesting picks. And I do want to highlight Matt's draft, the start of the draft here, where he's gone defender, forward, and we go ahead to the fourth round. He went another defender. So didn't get a mid until round 5. Because of the captains on options, I don't think you're looking to captain Dylan Moore. I don't think you're looking to captain Jack McRae. So he really is putting a lot of eggs in the Harry Sheasel basket when it comes to captaincy. So I think there's a little bit of a risk here. I don't know if I would have gone forward straight away because of the fact that there was still some good players on the board. I was very upset that at my round 3 selection that Jordan Dawson was off the board. He was someone that I think fell too far. I think he has the upside to be the number 1 player in the game. And when you can get the number 1 upside or potential number 1 scoring player in the 3rd round, I think you do that, especially if you've locked away 2 other positions. So if I was in this position, I like the obviously I talked about before, not going those midfielders early, but I do think that a player like Dawson was the last of a tier drop-off, in my opinion. So I think that him falling to where he did at pick 5 is a big steal there from Stevie Fizz. So I was hoping he was going to be there. He obviously got picked 1 pick before me. So this is where, again, I haven't drafted a forward, and in my projections, I have a group of 6 to 7 players that I think can average potentially 90 plus, or at least 85 plus. And the final 2 players of that, and since this draft, I revised my projections, and an 8th player has joined the list. But at the time, my projections had Mateus Philippou as someone in the same tier as a McRae, as a Daniel, as a Dylan Moore, Horne-Francis, and Bailey Smith. So Philippou, to me, was the last player in that tier. So I was very happy to lock him away. I did not want to go into the rest of this draft doing something like what we talk about later, but Selby had to do, where he didn't draft a forward until pick 83. And at that point, you're just basically crossing your fingers and hoping. So I wanted to get someone in that position that I felt very confident in. And I do feel fairly confident in Mateus Philippou in what we've seen so far. I think his role will be very, very strong. I think he's got good scoring pedigree. I can see a world where he's got a wider range than some of these other guys because we have a limited sample size. My low of him is 80, my high is 100. So he averages out to be around that 90 sort of a ranked player. But I'm very happy to get him at that sort of spot. So my next pick, at pick 35, Isaac Rankin. I was looking at Isaac Heaney, was probably the next guy that I was considering at this sort of a spot. He was sort of one of the players up in that tier that I sort of, with reflection, could I have got an Isaac Rankin at this spot? I think I could have, and in the interest of a mock draft and seeing how it went, I probably do regret that pick, and I probably should have got an Isaac Heaney and seen if an Isaac Rankin was going to be there at the next round. However, I wanted to illustrate the point in terms of my own rankings that I have Rankin, funnily enough, as a half tier kind of below the Philippous, the McRaes, the Daniels, but a half tier or a tier above the next group of guys, which are your Graham Myers, your Liam Bakers, your Connor McDonalds, your Jai Simpkins and Jeremy Camerons. I think there's a decent enough drop off between Isaac Rankin and what he can do and those other players. I do have another player that has crept into that, the more research that I've done to join him. So I have two players in sort of a bit of a tier 2.5, I would say, with Rankin, with Bailey Smith being in his own tier, and then Horn Francis through to Philippou being in that tier 2. So the Rankin pick, I think, if I were to guess, I would have guessed that he probably would have been available at that next pick. I think I'm a bit higher on him than some of these other guys. However, I don't know. So, bit of regret going Rankin instead of someone like a Heaney or even a Tim Taranto at this spot. But the drop-off in the forward was my main concern, and I thought I could get a few other mids later on. The Will Ashcroft pick I wanted to highlight here, I think this is too early here, and I'm sorry, Louis, if I'm beating you up a bit. It's just a difference of opinion, right? Like, you could be right, I could be wrong. This is just my 2 cents. So I don't think there's necessarily, I'm not trying to pick on you, mate, but just want to give my 2 cents. The Will Ashcroft, if you're drafting Will Ashcroft before someone like Isaac Heaney, who had an absolutely outstanding season last year, you're putting a lot of stock in Will Ashcroft taking a big step forward. And I think that is potentially where he could get to, but I think you're discounting a bit of his floor. So Isaac Heaney went 105 last season, and that included an injury-affected game. So 106.5 in non-injury-affected games. So you're basically drafting Will Ashcroft here, expecting him to go 105 at a minimum. And I think that is extremely bullish. I think it's possible, but I think that you could have got him later. And the downside, if he doesn't go 105 here, when you had guys that are very bankable 105 averaging players still on the board in the midfield that were there, I think is a little bit too high, in my opinion, to take Will Ashcroft ahead of those players. I was, again, a little annoyed that my boy Bailey Dale didn't make it to me on this pick. So Warney getting him there at pick 42, I think, is a great selection. I think he is a tier above your Clarks, your McKerchers. Mills is interesting here by Stevie Fizz. Mills going at pick 45. It is, and again, I'll reference the podcast that Stevie Fizz did a lot because it's the only other podcast on this draft. He talks about tier breakers and players that have the potential to really move the needle when it comes to your draft. And I think Callum Mills is that type of a player. He is the guy that could average 100, 105 if he's in the right role. He also has potential to be a bit of a bust at this point, but you've got to take that sort of a risk. I remember in a mock draft that we did last year, I took Zorko, I think maybe a little bit later than this, and I took a Sheasler around this spot where at that time it was sort of like, okay, what are they going to do? And those ended up being great selections. Now, the closer we get to the preseason, you might not be able to get Mills at this spot. You might find that Mills, because we know he's a bit more of a midfielder, we know he's going to be inside there, that he creeps up. Or it might go the other way. So this is, again, it depends on when you're drafting, but I think this, at the time of drafting, has the potential to really be a rewarding pick. I went LDU here. It's sort of just a player that I think in certain matchups can put up massive scores. Pretty solid young player. I don't see too much downside, so not a huge swing here. Sicily, Myers, and this is where the next tier of the forwards start to go. And this is the tier of the forwards that I want nothing to do with. I don't want anything to do with Brian Myers, Liam Baker, Jeremy Cameron, Connor McDonald I like a little bit. But these guys on any given day can give you a 40. On any given day, they can give you a ton. I just don't see much separation. So when I have to pick one of them, I would rather lock away one or two early on and then just forget about it and pick up my forwards very late and see if I can get some upside guys late and maybe rotate that position depending on matchups, stream the position, if you will, for all those in the draft lingo. Because I don't see much of a difference between Brian Myers, Liam Baker, and these guys. I mean, there'll be a difference over the season, but week to week, any given matchup, if you can get a guy off the waiver wire who's got a positive matchup, they might have a chance to outscore Brian Myers that week. Whereas I think those guys that are a bit more steady, a bit more locked into a nice friendly role that are always going to be featured in that team, I think those guys are going to be the guys that you can stick there and go, yeah, week in, week out, I'm pretty confident they're going to outscore the players that I could potentially stream off the waiver wire. Nank was an interesting selection here. So obviously we had Tim English go. So we had 4 rucks go within the first 11 picks. And then we waited 41 picks until the next ruck was taken off the board, which I think is how it should be. I think that's what people should be doing as the draft comes around, because you've got Sherry, you've got Marshall, you've got Max Gawn, you've got Tim English, all there. These guys are your 110, 115 averaging players. You've then got probably a 10-point drop-off to the next ruckman, which is Nank, who's usually about that high 90s, low 100s sort of a player. So that should be reflective in the ADP. You're not going to draft a player 10 points worse off than the previous player in their positions anywhere close to that player, especially when there's so many other players after that could be within those realms as well. So the patience holding off on the rucks here after the top 4 went, I think is exactly what should happen in most drafts. If in your draft, you see Tim English go off the board and someone reaches for a Nank at round 3 or round 4, I think you should be licking your lips, because in my opinion, that's a bit of a wasted selection, because the separation between Nank and the other rucks immediately after him, I don't think is very high. So I think you'd be able to pick up a midfielder that should have gone there at a better value. So if I'm not getting those first 4 rucks, I am very happy, very, very happy to sit and wait to get one of those other rucks later on in the draft and pile on those mids, forwards, and defenders. So that definitely happened in this draft here, and I think it's what should happen. I'll highlight my Rory Laird selection in, what round is this? We don't have the rounds here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Round 6, pick 55 overall. I was very happy to get Rory Laird here. Now, at this point, I've only got Lachie Whitfield as a defender. I've picked 2 mids, 2 forwards at this point. Now, Rory Laird is a mid-only player right now, but I'm kind of hedging my bets here. So Rory Laird, a lot of talk about him going into the half-back line. So either I'm drafting at a 100 averaging midfielder, which Rory Laird is when he plays midfield, which again at this spot I think is very, very good. I think he's at 100 averaging midfielder. He's out averaging Parrish. He's out averaging Newcomb, Warner. He's probably out averaging Luke Davies Jr., who I drafted around before. Or he's moving back into defense, picking up defensive status in round 6, and maybe he's a 90 to 95 averaging defender. And again, 90 to 95, that's pretty comparable to the Sicilies, the Mills, the McKercher, the Clarks, the Bailey Dales, who were picked around earlier. So I see this as a bit of a win-win situation. Either he's a 100 averaging mid, or he's a 90 to 95 averaging defender. That's how I see him this season. And I think either way in this spot, I'm getting a good pick in this position. I was getting close at this spot to pulling the trigger on a Clayton Oliver, who did go the next round at pick 63. If he made it to me, I was going to pull the trigger at that sort of a spot. I am nervous about Clayton Oliver, but we talk about those tier breakers. If you can get a Clayton Oliver at pick 55 and he goes close to a 110, which we know he's capable of doing, then this is a spot where you're getting 10 to 15 points of value compared to the other players going around in that position. So that was another player that I definitely was considering at this spot in the draft. So after Laird went Parrish, McDonald, Newcomb, Warner, Brodie Grundy, again another ruck. So one round where we got 2 rucks, Nank and Grundy going. I think that's typically the order that they were going. It's not the order that I have them projected at. I have actually a player who we'll talk about in a second ranked higher than both of these players, but there is a bit of risk associated. I think those are the 2 safest ruckmen that come after Tim English. But like we said, 4 rounds of no rucks after the English pick, which was what we would want to do. So we'll highlight that Oliver pick again. So Selby picks Oliver at pick 63. I think this is a great selection. It's Clayton freaking Oliver. And this is the pick that could easily... Clayton Oliver could average... He could be his highest averaging player. Like, that is a legitimate scenario that Clayton Oliver is the highest averaging player in Selby's team. Obviously, he's got Rowan Marshall. There's risk associated, obviously, but we've seen him average 114, 115 before, and he's still in the prime of his career in terms of his age bracket. We expect his role to be where it is, where he was averaging as 110. So this is an upside pick that I think is it's a great spot to draft him. Like I said, I was going to draft him. I considered it here, but wanted the flexibility of the defense because I only had the 1 defender, and if he did make it to me in the next pick, I would have gone there. Didn't work out. He goes at pick 63. My next selection, Will Day. Just a bit of an upside pick here. I think, again, it's hard to know without the ADP being really rock solid, but this is about where I think he should go. I would argue that Will Day can average more than a Paddy Cripps. He can average more than a John Newcomb, surely. I think interesting the fact that Newcomb went before Will Day. I think that Will Day is the best AFL producer for the Hawks. So curious for Selby going Newcomb ahead of a Will Day in that situation. We're just comparing the 2 Hawks players. I think in most scenarios, I would definitely be drafting Will Day ahead of a John Newcomb. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of that risk, the injury factor you could point to, but he's my last starting midfielder, my 4th midfielder. Obviously, Rory Laird potentially could move to defense later in the season. So he is a player that I could swap and change depending on the matchups with my bench mid. So I thought he was pretty solid there. I think he's young enough that he still has some untapped potential. Could be a 100 plus averaging midfielder. And that's the kind of thing, right? I don't want to get a guy who at this kind of a point, his upside is kind of known. It's my last 1 to 2 spots in that position. So you want a guy that has the capacity to surprise you. You want a guy who has the capacity to sort of blow out the expectations. Like a Patrick Cripps, I don't really see that. Just to highlight that kind of a pick, I don't really see that with a Darcy Parish. I know he's done 108s before, but the midfield's changed. Like, it doesn't run through him anymore. I don't really see it with Chad Warner, although he's a very good player. There's a lot of other players in that mix with Heaney, Errol, and obviously Callum Mills. So there's a lot of competition there. Matty Rao, we don't really expect that. He's a great player. I love Matty Rao, but from a fantasy perspective, I don't really see that with those types of players, but I can see it with Clayton Oliver. I can see it with a Will Day where they just unexpectedly blow up and exceed our expectations. We'll run through a few of these other guys. The guy who I was alluding to before, which I have moved up in my rankings and my projections, is Shea Bolton, and I think this is an awesome selection here from Roy. Pick 71, Shea Bolton. So I don't know what rank that is for the forwards, but he's picked Shea Bolton after Brian Myers, Liam Baker, Jeremy Cameron, Connor McDonald, Giant Simpkin, Brent Daniels, Matt Kennedy. I would take Shea Bolton ahead of all of those players. I think that he has the potential to be an 85 averaging forward. Obviously, there's upside with all of those other guys if certain things go their way, but Shea, to me, can keep everything the same with what he did last season. He's going to a better team that scores more fantasy points, and he still should see improvement. So I think that's an excellent value play from Roy there, getting Shea Bolton as late as he did, pick 71. So he started with a Bailey Smith and a Shea, 2 forwards that I think are pretty safe with, at least for Shea, an 80 average minimum, which for most weeks should be enough to sort of be those kind of players that you can plug and play and not worry about. My next selection here was Tom De Koning. Now, we talked about waiting on the rucks. It was at this point where I started to go, I don't see too much really high upside guys in the other positions. So whilst I could have waited further on the rucks, Tom De Koning to me ticks the box of those tier breakers. I can see him having that untapped upside like a Tristan Sherry did, like a Max Gawn or a Brodie Grundy the year before, like Tim English has done in the years gone past, like Ron Marshall did when he first started becoming a solo ruck. I think Tom De Koning has that upside. Now, there definitely is associated risk, and he obviously, compared to averages last year, I'm drafting him ahead of his average last year, but I'm projecting him to improve. And it's at this point of the draft, the middle point of the draft, you've got to take these punts. These are the picks that set you apart. So going Tom De Koning early, Luke was sitting next to me at the time. He wasn't a fan of the pick, but I think this is where you can win or lose your draft, right? So taking the punts on Tom De Koning, who I see realistic upside to be 105 averaging ruckman. I think if all goes his way, he could even approach the 110s. Now, a lot of things would have to go his way, so it's not likely, but it's possible. And I think you need to always open yourself up for those possibilities for you to win your league. So I wanted to highlight him there. Obviously, what was it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I was the 7th player to draft a ruckman. So not right at the very end, but I saw Tom De Koning in the same tier as a Nank and a Brodie Grundy. So again, that tiering sort of thing where he's the last player in that tier. I feel like I got really good value waiting an extra round when no rucks were picked after Grundy and Nank went. I didn't want to risk him going off the board and not loving a lot of the high upside options in the other positions afterwards. Because after him went Canelio, Luke Jackson. Interesting that he went at this point before Sean Darcy, who went to the same team, so that was good that, who's that? That's Louis got them paired together. I think that's obviously a great pairing, great handcuff. But it is interesting that he went first. The ruck forward flexibility is nice, but really you need Sean Darcy to be out for Luke Jackson to be justifiable at this sort of a spot, and it's just not something I want to be in the business of relying on. Few other picks sort of went here. This is where the really speculative forward picks start to happen. Sean Manor, no idea how to rank Sean Manor because Geelong's just tricky. They've got a few moving pieces. He's young. Some analysts are saying that is Sean Manor even in the side? I don't know. I think he should be, but yeah, hard to get a read there. Riley Sanders, it's a massive punt. He was in and out of the side. Bevo's still there. Yes, you lost Jack McRae. Yes, you lost Caleb Daniel, but you've now got Matt Kennedy joining the fray as well. It's a punt, right? And being your first forward, this could completely fall off. And this is obviously the sacrifice that Selby's done. He's gone strong in his mids. Defense is nice. He's obviously got one of the best ruckmen in the game. So he's built up a lot of other positions elsewhere, and he's just punted the forwards. So that is a strategy. I don't think it's a strategy that I want to employ this season. I want to get at least one of those solid guys because I don't want to just have all of one position just be dart throws. Because then you're having to do a lot when it comes to doing the waiver wire. I want at least one of them to be that way because then you have the opportunity to get value off the waiver wire, but I don't want all of them to be that. So interesting that this is obviously now where we start to get those risky forward lines and really not even everyone has a forward yet. Although I think, was that the last player to... Yes, I think Selby was the last person to draft a forward at pick 83. So yeah, interesting strategy there. Matt Roberts, Jordan Ridley, these picks, Redmond and McGrath, I didn't love them. I needed to fill out my defense. A few players like Matt Roberts, I would have loved to get to me. I was eyeing off Kane Farrell, but wasn't 100% sure. I might have regret not going Nick Blostone. I think there's some upside there with how I expect Richmond to play this season, so I think I probably regret not drafting Blostone instead of McGrath. So Redmond and McGrath and back-to-back picks. Obviously, I'm hedging my bets a little bit there with the Essendon players. I don't know. I don't love the picks because I don't see a huge amount of upside, and that's usually what I'm hunting for at this sort of a spot. So, yeah, I think I took some more punts earlier with the Will Day, the Tom De Koning, the Lairds a little bit earlier. Those are sort of my upside picks, but these defenders around at my starting defense, I don't love. I see them as pretty safe, 80 to 85 sort of guys, which I think is fine. Just not my favorite picks. Some other picks that I liked in this area, I think Jesse Hogan fell a fair way. So who picked him up? Jaden Poposky. I'm sure I stuff that up every time. So getting him at this point, I think is good value. Sam Darcy is an interesting pick because he's just a gun of a young talent. So Jesse Hogan slipped all the way to 109, which is pretty interesting. I did go Charlie Curnow ahead of Jesse Hogan. I think Curnow is just better year over year. He seems to be the most consistent, outside of a Jeremy Cameron, the most consistent key forward. And if I can get a solid matchup for him, I will look to do that and maybe stream that final forward position when Curnow has some tougher matchups. So those are my thoughts there. But like I said, I think Velostone was a good selection there by Warney, who seemed to scoop up some of the guys that fell a bit too far. Matt Crouch was an interesting one. He seemed to be the guy that everyone was auto-drafting when they ran out of time. But I think getting Matt Crouch at that spot is very, very good value. A lot of people are sort of pushing him out of the side in Adelaide. And whilst it's definitely a risk, I think he is there. I think he's there round one. And when he is there, I think he's a 95 to 100 averaging mid. And that, at this point, when you're drafting the likes of Chera, Doherty, Tim Kelly in that round, like that is by far and away better than those players. And those other guys have the risks associated with them as well. So I think the risk with Crouch is relatively equal to some of those guys, but the upside is higher. So I think that's actually a very good selection. If I had a midfield spot on my starting team available, I probably would have gone a Matt Crouch instead of a Redmond or a McGrath. I had just left my defenders a bit late. So perhaps reflection is maybe getting a defender a little bit earlier is probably how I could have approached this draft a little bit better, in my opinion. Maybe someone like a Jaden Shaw instead of an LDU is something that I probably could have looked at. In fact, I probably should have. So that's a bit of a learning that I'll take away from this one for my own personal team. Then we get into the bench, and this is all upside here. So I'll just read out the guys that I drafted. Jack Viney, which I thought was interesting that he fell that far. He was a 100 averaging player just a season ago, so there's some upside there with Melbourne hopefully just getting better. Will Powell, I have no idea what to expect from Will Powell. Only the fact that he's a young player. There's some talk about him playing in the midfield. Obviously, you've got some guys coming over. It could be a player that I drop straight away, but I think there's upside. There's a world where he averages 90 plus. So I want to be exposed to that. Sam Durham, again, young player. On the off chance that he improves, like some people say that he could, I wanted to get him. And I skipped over, but Riley O'Brien was my first player that I drafted on my bench. It's not often you can grab a number one solo ruck on your bench who's a 90-plus averaging player. The fact that I took Tom De Koning, who has some risk, I wanted to have a really strong backup ruckman. So again, I can play that matchup game when I come up with, maybe Tom De Koning has a poor matchup, or there's a week where Mark Pitnett comes into the side again randomly. I can then just pivot over and put Riley O'Brien on the field. I don't lose too much in that situation. I would have preferred Witts, personally. He went one pick before me. So Riley O'Brien, I was very happy to have as a guy I'm pretty confident can average over 90 for the season. So I had to pick 115. And that's why leaving the rucks late is a strategy that you can do, because getting a 90-plus averaging player on your bench is not something you can really do in any other line. Even the midfielders, where obviously the most good scorers are. Viney didn't average 90 last year. DeGoey didn't average 90 last year. I mean, some of them could, but it's not a sure thing. Whereas I think I'm pretty confident that Riley O'Brien, if he's in the team, he's going to be averaging 90 in just that role that he's playing. So that is the team. I'll read out if... Hold up. Let's have a look at the team in a... or even look at this team summary. I'm still figuring out the slide record. This is the team listed on here. Ignore... So Jack Finnegan was an auto pick because we set too many players on. So I didn't actually select him. But basically Durham should be there, but this is how it looks. So Lockie Whitfield, Mason Redmond, and McGrath in my defense. Like I said, learnings from this, I probably should have targeted a defender maybe earlier instead of like the LDU. So had I gone, a short instead of an LDU, I would have been able to pick up someone like a Matt Crouch instead of a Redmond and a short instead of an LDU. I think I would have preferred that with the value of hindsight, but that's how it ended up. Brayshaw, LDU, Laird, and Will Day. And remember that Laird is someone that after round 6, I'm expecting I'm going to be able to move him into my defense. So that way I can then push someone like a Viney onto my field. Laird goes onto the bench, and either Redmond or McGrath can move to my bench, whoever is performing better at the time. Tom de Koning as my ruck, and my forward line, Matthias Philippou, Isaac Rankin, and Charlie Curnow. Now, Charlie Curnow was one of my last forwards. After I get an assessment of, okay, is Will Powell worthy of holding on to? Do I bother with Sam Durham? Hopefully I'll be able to see those sort of things early on. And then if the answer is no to either one of those players, that's when I start to pick up someone off the waiver wire who I can cycle in and out based on matchups for Charlie Curnow if he has a poor matchups. Whereas my Philippou and Rankins, I envision them sitting there for the entire season unless injury strikes. And then in this league, we would have an IR position that we can move them into, and I would get someone else. So that is the team. That is the general strategy that went into the draft. Hopefully, we'll do some more mock drafts with both other analysts and also with you guys. So I will be announcing how I can do that or how you can get involved in mock drafts in the future. I'll hopefully be doing another one in February, I think. So stay tuned to social media and listen to the podcast to see how you can enter and be involved in that if you are interested in doing some mock drafts. I do think it's a very valuable thing to do if you are a keen fantasy draft player. But until then, next guy, we're going to be talking about forwards and rucks next week when it comes to the classic podcast with myself and Luke. And we will finally get onto those tier videos, which I have been teasing for a couple of weeks now, starting with the defenders, the mids, the rucks, and the forwards. So until then, guys, we'll see you guys later. Bye.